The sign was old, flickering with a dim red neon glow against the darkening sky. The Sleepy Pines Motel. Tom squinted, barely making out the name as he pulled his car into the gravel lot. It was late. He was exhausted from a grueling drive, and this was the only place he'd seen in miles. He hadn't planned on stopping for the night, but something about the empty road ahead seemed more unsettling than this rundown establishment. Besides, he figured, how bad could it be? The receptionist barely looked up as he entered. She was an older woman with greasy hair pulled back into a tight bun and dull, lifeless eyes that fixed somewhere over his shoulder. Her name tag read Doris. She slid him an old-fashioned key with a number tag attached. "Room 8, she said, her voice hollow, almost mechanical. Her hand trembled slightly as she pointed down the dim corridor leading to the rooms. Tom thanked her, though she didn't respond back, and trudged down the corridor, feeling the atmosphere grow heavier with every step. The motel was unnaturally quiet. No sounds of other guests, no hum of a television or murmur of voices, just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. As he reached room 8, he noticed an odd smell, sharp and metallic, like old rust or blood. He shook his head, chalking it up to his nerves and his own exhaustion. Inside, the room was exactly what he expected. Shabby, dimly lit, and with a bed that sagged in the middle. Still, it would do for the night. He tossed his bag on the chair and sat on the bed, feeling springs poke uncomfortably into his back. As he scanned the room, something odd caught his eye. There were scratches on the walls, as though someone had frantically scraped at the peeling paint with their fingernails. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting shadows that danced across the room before plunging him into darkness. Tom froze, his breath catching. A faint creak sounded like a floorboard straining under weight. He strained his ears, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came. Shaking his head, he tried to laugh it off as a quirk of the place. Motels like this had 1,000 reasons for odd noises. He fumbled for his phone to use as a flashlight, but stopped short, realizing he was no longer alone. Standing by the bathroom door was a shadow, a figure so faint it was almost as if it had been painted onto the darkness itself. Tom stared, his heart hammering as he tried to convince himself that it was a trick of the light. He blinked, and the figure was gone. But in the silence that followed, he felt an oppressive weight, as if the very air around him were thickening. Tom took a shaky breath and lay back on the bed, telling himself he was overtired. But sleep wouldn't come. The motel was too silent. And then, just as he was starting to drift off, there was a knock on the door. It was a gentle knock, soft and persistent. Tom froze, listening, hoping it would stop. But the knock came again, a little louder this time. He reached for his phone, glancing at the time, 3:13 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. But the knock continued, louder still. Against his better judgment, he swung his legs off the bed and approached the door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob as his mind flashed with every horror story he'd ever heard about strangers at the door. He looked through the peephole and saw nothing. The hallway was empty. Tom's hand dropped, his heart still pounding. Just as he turned to walk away, the knocking resumed. This time it was coming from inside the room. His blood ran cold, and he backed away, glancing around wildly. The sound seemed to come from the closet, a rhythmic, insistent thudding as if someone were trapped inside, desperate to get out. Against every instinct, he edged toward the closet, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He pulled it open, and the smell hit him, an overpowering stench of rot and decay. The closet was empty, but on the inside of the door, he saw something that made his stomach lurch. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood were the words, "Help me." He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet as he backed into the bed. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into an even deeper darkness. Panic overtook him, and he scrambled for his phone, his fingers clumsy as he tried to dial the front desk. But there was no signal. He tried again and again, but each time his screen showed only the mocking message, "No service." Then a whisper. It was so soft, so close to his ear that he felt warm breath against his skin. "Get out!" Tom spun around, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear anything else. But the whisper came again, more urgent this time. "Get out, while you still can." He didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and bolted, nearly tearing the door off its hinges in his haste to leave the room. The hallway was as dark and silent as when he had entered. But as he ran, he thought he could hear footsteps behind him, heavy, dragging footsteps that seemed to get closer with every step. He didn't stop running until he burst into the lobby. Doris was gone, replaced by a different receptionist, a man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes who looked at Tom with mild concern. "Everything okay, sir?" Tom could barely catch his breath. I need to check out, now." The man's eyes softened. He glanced down, pulling out a register and flipping through the pages. "Sir, you checked into room 8? Tom nodded, still shaking. The man sighed. "You wouldn't be the first one to leave in the middle of the night," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "But I'm afraid I can't help you." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" The man looked at him, a strange sadness in his eyes. "Room 8. No one stayed in that room for years, since the girl who went missing there. We keep it closed off. For some reason, the key keeps turning up." Tom stared at him, words caught in his throat. He looked back toward the corridor, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw her, a faint silhouette of a girl standing just beyond the lobby, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. He didn't wait to see more. Tom tore out of the lobby, got into his car, and sped away, gravel spraying as he left the Sleepy Pines Motel in his rearview mirror. But as he drove, he felt something cold settle over him, a dread he couldn't shake. Later, when he stopped at a gas station miles down the road, he finally dared to check his rearview mirror, half convinced it had all been his imagination. But in the back seat, he saw the faint outline of something he couldn't explain, a bloody handprint smudged on the leather. It was supposed to be a simple stay, just a quick night's rest before Sarah got back on the road. She'd driven 8 hours straight, and when she saw the glowing vacancy sign at the Sunny Hills Motor Lodge, she took it as a sign to pull over. The motel looked decent enough from the outside, though its name was peeling off the front sign, and a few of the rooms were cloaked in darkness. Still, she was too tired to be picky. The front desk clerk was a gruff man in his 60s, his gray beard stained yellow from cigarette smoke. He didn't look her in the eye, just muttered, "Room 5. No phones in the rooms, no internet. It's old school here." As he handed her a brass key, his fingers lingered for a moment, as if he was deciding whether to say something else, but he let go and went back to staring at the yellowed newspapers behind the counter. Room 5 was tucked around the back, right by the vending machines. As Sarah entered, she was hit by a blast of stale air. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else she couldn't place, sharp and coppery. She turned on the lamp by the bed, its light weak and sputtering, barely illuminating the shadows in the corners. She felt uneasy, but told herself it was just fatigue playing tricks. After setting down her bag, she decided to take a quick shower to shake off the road weariness. The bathroom light flickered as she turned it on, and the cracked mirror above the sink cast her reflection in an eerie, ghostly pallor. As she adjusted the water, she noticed something odd on the wall. Scratches, long and erratic, as if someone had clawed at the plaster in a frenzy. They were deep, far too deep for fingernails, and some looked fresh as if they'd been made recently. A shiver ran through her, but she told herself that maybe some animal had gotten in, though she knew that was unlikely. She got in the shower, the warm water a brief comfort, but then she heard it, barely audible over the water, a faint scratching sound. Her pulse quickened as she strained to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. She hurried through the rest of her shower, feeling as if she was being watched. After drying off, she noticed her skin was prickling with goosebumps, even though the room was warm. The bathroom mirror was fogged up, and as she leaned in to wipe it, she froze. Through the steam, she saw something in the reflection, something behind her, a tall figure, shadowy and indistinct, just barely visible over her shoulder. She whipped around, but the bathroom was empty. Her heart pounding, Sarah grabbed her bag, deciding she would leave right then and find another place. She didn't care if she had to sleep in her car. This motel was wrong. She turned to grab her key, but it was gone. She searched everywhere, the dresser, the bed, her bag, but the key had vanished. Panic rising, she went to the door, intending to ask the clerk for a spare, but as her hand gripped the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. She tried again, twisting and pulling, but the lock seemed jammed. A sudden, suffocating feeling filled the room. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. As she turned, her eyes were drawn to something that hadn't been there before, a small wooden box on the nightstand. She was sure it hadn't been there when she arrived. Trembling, she lifted the lid. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was blurry, grainy, but she could make out her own face staring back at her with an expression of terror. In the photo, she was sitting on the bed, but she hadn't taken any pictures. Her stomach twisted. How could someone have taken a photo of her in this room, just now? She turned to the bed, noticing a dark stain on the mattress that she hadn't seen earlier. It looked like old blood, smeared across the sheets. She covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Her only thought now was to get out, break a window if she had to. But as she moved toward the window, she heard it again. That scratching sound, louder now, closer, as if it were coming from inside the room. She backed up, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes scanning for the source of the noise. And then she saw it. Something moving under the bed, a slow, deliberate scraping sound. In a flash of dread, she realized someone or something was lying underneath. She could see a pale hand creeping out from the shadows, its fingers long and thin, with nails that looked chipped and broken. She was paralyzed, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The hand stopped, and then, slowly, a face appeared, peering out from the darkness beneath the bed. Its eyes were wide and blank, its mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. She stumbled over her own feet and fell backward, scrambling toward the door as she kept her eyes locked on the figure that was now crawling out from beneath the bed, dragging itself slowly, deliberately toward her. She could hear it breathing, a raspy, gurgling sound that sent chills down her spine. Just as it reached her, she screamed, slamming her hands against the door, praying it would open. And suddenly, it did. She tumbled backward into the hallway, looking up to see the figure in the doorway, standing in a way that was horribly wrong, its limbs twisted, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. The figure stared at her with those empty, dead eyes, and in a voice that was barely a whisper, it said, "You shouldn't have stayed here." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls, past vacant rooms with doors ajar and lights flickering, as if the whole place were alive with the same dark energy. She could feel the thing chasing her, hear its shuffling steps behind her as she made it to the lobby. But when she burst through the lobby doors, she stopped short, gasping for air, and looked around. The front desk was empty. The lobby itself was deserted, as if no one had been there in years. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling, and the walls were cracked and peeling. Outside, her car was gone, the parking lot empty under a sky that had turned a sickly shade of gray. She felt a crushing realization. She was trapped. The motel wasn't just haunted. It was as if the whole place had shifted, warped into something that wasn't meant to let her go. She looked back one last time and saw them standing there, the clerk, the shadowy figure, and a line of other guests with the same terrified expressions on their faces. They all watched her with dead, hollow eyes, and then one by one, they faded into the shadows, leaving her alone. The storm had come on suddenly, blackening the sky in a matter of minutes and sending a torrent of rain down on the highway. Jack was on a road trip, eager to make it across the state before dawn, but as visibility dropped to nearly zero, he knew he had to find shelter. He spotted a weathered sign with peeling paint that read, "The Crossroads Inn, Vacancy." A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the silhouette of a narrow building nestled at the end of a long, dark drive. As he pulled into the lot, Jack's headlights swept over an empty parking area, not a single car in sight. The place looked abandoned, but the vacancy sign flickered dimly, and a faint light glowed in the lobby. Jack hurried inside, shaking off the rain as he entered. The lobby was musty, and the walls were lined with outdated wallpaper, faded and curling at the edges. Behind the front desk sat an elderly man with pale, sunken eyes that looked as though they hadn't seen the sun in years. He didn't smile, just nodded as Jack approached. "One room, please," Jack said, eager to dry off and get some sleep. The old man's voice was raspy as he slid an old-fashioned brass key across the counter. "Room 12, he murmured. "End of the hall. Don't open the curtains." Jack blinked, confused, but the man offered no further explanation. Brushing off the strange warning, he headed down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls seemed to close in as he walked, and the old patterned carpet muffled his footsteps. Finally, he reached room 12, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was basic, with a single bed, a small dresser, and a dusty mirror. Rain hammered against the window, and shadows danced along the walls as the lightning flashed outside. Jack tossed his bag onto the bed and started to settle in when he noticed the curtains. They were drawn tightly over the window, but he felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic curiosity to see what lay beyond them. But the old man's words echoed in his mind. "Don't open the curtains." Jack tried to ignore it. He sat on the bed, flipping through an old, dog-eared magazine he'd found on the nightstand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The room felt stifling, the air thick and heavy. Finally, his curiosity got the better of him. Just a quick look, he thought. What harm could it do? He stood, his hand trembling as he reached for the edge of the curtain. As his fingers brushed the fabric, a cold draft seeped into the room, chilling him to the bone. Slowly, he pulled the curtain aside, just enough to peek through the narrow gap. What he saw made his blood run cold. Outside the window, just inches from the glass, was a pale face. A woman, her eyes wide and unblinking, stared directly at him. Her skin was a ghastly gray, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She didn't move, didn't blink, just hovered there as if waiting for him to open the window. Jack staggered back, slamming the curtain shut, his heart racing as he struggled to breathe. As he backed away, he heard a faint tapping, delicate, almost polite, like fingernails gently rapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. He clapped his hands over his ears, desperately trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. The storm outside raged on, but he could no longer hear the thunder or the rain. All he could hear was that unrelenting tapping. His phone had no service, and he felt trapped, as if the very room were closing in on him. He threw himself onto the bed, covering his head with a pillow, but even that couldn't drown out the sound. The tapping grew louder, angrier, until it was a pounding, as if someone were trying to break through the glass. Suddenly, everything stopped. Silence filled the room. Jack held his breath, not daring to move. He counted the seconds, hoping the nightmare was over. But then, slowly, he heard the faintest whisper, a voice that sounded cracked and distant, yet somehow impossibly close. "Jack," it whispered, his name echoing softly in the stillness. He felt the blood drain from his face. How did she know his name? He squeezed his eyes shut, praying that this was just a trick of his exhausted mind. But when he opened them, he saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the woman, her face now contorted with a look of sorrow mixed with rage. She raised a hand, pointing a single bony finger directly at him. Paralyzed with fear, Jack couldn't move. The woman's mouth opened, wider and wider, impossibly so, until it was a black, gaping maw as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. Her eyes, lifeless and empty, seemed to bore into his soul. Just then the door flew open, and Jack's paralysis broke. He leapt up and bolted from the room, nearly tripping over his own feet as he ran down the hallway. He didn't stop until he was back in the lobby, drenched in sweat and panting for air. The old man was still there, sitting at the desk as if he hadn't moved. He looked up as Jack stumbled in, his expression weary but unsurprised. "I told you," he said quietly. "I told you not to open the curtains." Jack tried to speak, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. The old man just shook his head slowly. She only appears to those who break the rule," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People like you, who can't resist looking where they shouldn't." Jack backed away, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. He ran out into the rain, not stopping to gather his things, his only thought to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. As he reached his car, he glanced back at the motel one last time. In the window of room 12, he saw her, standing there, her pale face pressed against the glass, watching him with that twisted, unnatural smile. He sped away into the night. The image of her face burned into his memory, and he knew he'd never be able to forget it. No matter how far he drove, he could still feel her eyes on him, could still hear the faint, ghostly whisper of his name following him into the darkness. And he had the dreadful sense that no matter where he went, she would always be waiting, watching from just outside his view, ready to appear the moment he dared to look. And for the rest of his life, every time he was alone, every time he glanced out of the corner of his eye, he would see her, a pale face, a dark grin waiting in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the curtain. The air was thick and oppressive as Mia pulled her car into the lot of the Dover Pines Motel. It was nearly midnight, and the only light came from a dim, sputtering neon sign above the entrance. She'd planned on making it through town, but after miles of winding back roads and no other signs of civilization, she didn't have a choice. There was something off about the place, though. It felt hollow, like it was hiding something. The lobby was empty, save for an ancient, dusty bell on the counter. Mia tapped it, and the dull ring echoed through the quiet room. A moment later, an older woman appeared, her smile unnaturally wide, showing too many teeth. She wore a faded floral dress, her eyes blank and her skin sallow. She didn't speak, just handed Mia a tarnished brass key labeled Room 7. The woman's hand lingered on the key for just a moment too long, and as she let go, she whispered, "You can't leave until you know." Mia felt a shiver race down her spine, but she brushed it off. She was tired. She just needed to rest. The hallway leading to Room 7 was dark, the faded wallpaper peeling and the carpet damp under her shoes. Every door she passed was shut tightly, and she could feel something strange in the air, something charged. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and instantly regretted her decision. The room was ice cold, despite the muggy summer night outside. She flicked on the light, but it barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and flicker. The wallpaper was torn in places, claw marks gouged into the walls, and the smell, something between wet earth and decaying leaves, hung heavy in the air. Still, Mia told herself it was just for one night. She sat on the edge of the bed, kicking off her shoes, and tried to shake off the growing unease. But then she saw it. A small, yellowed photograph lying on the nightstand. She picked it up, squinting to make out the faded image. A family stood in front of the motel, all smiling except for a young girl in the center. Her face was turned, her expression one of sheer terror. And as Mia looked closer, she realized that behind the family in one of the motel windows was a shadowy figure staring out. Mia dropped the photo, her heart pounding. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her, like she was being watched. She forced herself to look around the room, but it was empty. Just as she was about to relax, a soft, dragging sound came from the closet. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the narrow opening. Her mind raced, telling her to run, to get out, but her body wouldn't listen. Slowly, she reached out, her hand trembling as she pulled the door open. The closet was empty, but scrawled all over the inside walls, in jagged letters that overlapped each other, were the words, "Don't look at it." Her stomach dropped. Don't look at what? She backed away, but the moment her hand left the closet door, she felt something shift behind her, like a faint whisper in the dark. She turned quickly, but the room was still. Then she noticed it. The mirror on the wall had fogged up, even though the room was freezing, and on the fogged glass a message had appeared, written as if by an invisible finger. "Turn around." Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the mirror. Against her will, her eyes flicked to her own reflection, and her stomach lurched. There was something else in the mirror, standing just behind her. A shadowy figure with a gaunt face and hollow, sunken eyes that glared directly at her. The figure's mouth stretched into a chilling smile, its teeth yellowed and broken. Its hand rose, long fingers with sharp, cracked nails reaching toward her reflection. She could feel a prickling at the back of her neck, the sensation of cold fingers brushing against her skin, though nothing was there. Just as she was about to scream, the figure whispered in a voice that seemed to rattle from somewhere deep within the walls. "Don't look away. You have to see." Terrified, she forced herself to glance back at the room, desperate to break free from the mirror's hold. But the room was empty, silent. No figure, no shadow, just her own panicked reflection staring back at her. She took a shuddering breath, feeling faint with relief, and moved toward the door, her mind set on leaving. But as she reached for the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. She twisted it harder, but it was stuck, as if the door had fused to the frame. Panic set in as she banged on the door, calling out for help, but there was only silence. The air grew colder, and then the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Mia felt her way back to the bed, clutching the edge as she heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Her heart pounded as she strained to see, but the shadows were too thick, swallowing everything. Then she felt it, an icy touch on her shoulder, gripping her tightly, pulling her backward. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, paralyzed by a force she couldn't see. In the darkness, she heard a faint, raspy voice, so close it felt as if it were inside her own head. "You didn't listen," it whispered. "You looked, and now you can't leave." Mia's vision blurred as the room seemed to dissolve around her, replaced by a sea of darkness. She felt herself falling, sinking into a place that was cold and empty, with only the faintest sounds of whispers around her. The next morning, the clerk arrived at room 7, key in hand. As he unlocked the door, he found the room empty, untouched, except for a small yellowed photograph on the bed. It showed the same family, the same girl looking terrified, and now, standing beside her, was another figure. A young woman, her face twisted in terror, frozen forever in the photo with hollow, lifeless eyes that stared out into nothing. The clerk sighed, picked up the photograph, and placed it back in the drawer. Another addition to the collection. As he closed the door, he whispered into the empty room, "You should have listened." It was supposed to be a quick trip. Eric and his friends, Trevor and Jane, were driving cross-country, and as the clock crept closer to 2 a.m., they decided to stop at the first place they found. A flickering sign for the Pine Haven Motel appeared on the edge of the empty road, its letters worn and cracked, some missing altogether. The surrounding trees loomed thick and shadowy, and a fog had rolled in, making the place feel like it was trapped in a different time. Inside the motel lobby, the air felt stagnant and too quiet. A single light buzzed overhead, casting a dim glow on an empty desk. As they waited, Eric noticed a guest book lying open, filled with signatures. He skimmed through the names, but what he found strange was that each entry was dated for the same night, today's date, every entry going back years. Some of the ink looked fresh, and the handwriting seemed urgent, almost desperate, like the writer had scribbled their name in a hurry. Just then, a door creaked open behind the desk, and a woman appeared. She was older, with deep-set eyes that looked like they held 1,000 secrets. Her smile was thin, and she stared a little too long at each of them, like she was measuring something. After a tense silence, she handed them a key labeled 3. "Sleep lightly," she murmured with an unsettling smirk, and disappeared before any of them could respond. They found room 3 at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The air smelled stale, with a faint metallic tang, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper, and the room itself was furnished with old, mismatched pieces. But what caught their attention was a mirror on the wall opposite the bed. It was large and ornate, surrounded by a tarnished silver frame. It seemed out of place, far too fancy for a rundown motel. As they settled in, Trevor walked up to the mirror, staring into it thoughtfully. "Weird place for a mirror," he muttered, running his fingers along the edge. "Feels off. Everything in this place feels off," Jane whispered, glancing around. They all nodded in agreement, but exhaustion won out, and soon they each claimed a spot in the room, ready to get what sleep they could. Sometime in the night, Eric jolted awake. He didn't know what had roused him, but his heart was pounding, and the room felt colder than before. The faint light from the parking lot cast long shadows across the walls. As his eyes adjusted, he looked over at the mirror and froze. In the dim glow, he could see his reflection staring back, but something was wrong. His reflection was standing beside him, facing the bed, looking at him with wide, glassy eyes. His mouth was parted in a terrified expression, even though Eric hadn't moved a muscle. His breath hitched, and his instinct was to look away, but he couldn't. He stared, paralyzed, as his reflection slowly lifted a hand and pointed toward the corner of the room. Trembling, Eric followed the direction of the pointing finger, his gaze shifting to the far corner. His heart stopped. In the shadows, barely visible, was a figure. Tall and thin, it seemed to blend into the darkness, almost as if it were part of the wall itself. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though he couldn't make out a face, he felt its gaze boring into him. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then the figure took a single silent step forward. Eric scrambled out of bed, gasping, and shook Trevor and Jane awake. They looked at him in confusion, then followed his panicked gaze to the mirror. The reflections now showed all 3 of them, but their mirror images were staring back with wide, terrified eyes, each one looking at something just behind them. "What's going on?" Jane whispered, her voice trembling. None of them dared to look away from the mirror, and as they watched, their reflections each began to move, independently of them, pointing to different corners of the room. Cold fear seeped into their bones as they realized that they were surrounded 4 corners, 4 figures in the shadows, each drawing closer, each more visible now, their hollow eyes fixed on them. "Get to the door," Eric hissed, reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. It was as if the entire room had shifted, trapping them inside. They pounded and pushed, desperate to escape, but the door remained sealed shut. Then, the figures in the room began to whisper, their voices overlapping in an eerie, disjointed chorus. It was faint at first, like leaves rustling, but as it grew louder, the words became clear. "You've seen us. You've seen us, and now you're part of us." The mirror began to vibrate, the glass rippling as if it were made of water. Eric, Trevor, and Jane watched in horror as their reflections stretched and distorted, their faces melting and twisting into the expressions of the figures in the room, blank and lifeless, their eyes hollow and sunken. The mirror reflections began to reach out, pressing their hands against the glass, pushing through as if trying to break free. With a surge of terror-fueled strength, Trevor kicked the door, and it finally burst open. They stumbled into the hallway, not daring to look back. The hallway was dark, and they sprinted toward the lobby, but as they reached the front desk, the older woman was waiting, her face cold and expressionless. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice devoid of any warmth. They didn't respond, bolting through the front doors and into the night. They piled into their car, slamming the doors and locking them, breathing heavily. Trevor started the engine, and they sped away, leaving the Pine Haven Motel behind. The silence in the car was heavy as they drove, each one too shaken to speak. But as they rounded a bend in the road, Jane gasped, clutching her mouth in horror. Eric looked back and felt his blood turn to ice. Reflected in the car's rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat, were the three shadowy figures, each one staring at them with hollow, soulless eyes. And then, in a voice that echoed from somewhere beyond the grave, one of them whispered, "You'll never leave us." The roadside inn was called the Stillwater Lodge. Its sign, flickering faintly in the misty night, was the only hint of civilization on the dark, winding road. Emma hadn't planned to stop, but her eyelids felt like they were weighed down with lead. She was hours behind schedule and hadn't seen another car or building for miles. She didn't have much choice. She pulled in and parked, the engine's hum giving way to a profound silence that seemed to swallow all sound. As she entered, Emma noticed that the lodge's lobby was eerily still, dust hanging in the air like a thin veil. Behind the front desk sat a man in an old, ill-fitting suit, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He stared straight through her, his mouth curled in a strange half-smile. When she asked for a room, he pushed a key across the counter without a word, his hand lingering on it for a beat too long. "Room 9, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "And whatever you hear tonight, don't open the door." Emma shivered, but dismissed it as her tired nerves acting up. She took the key and climbed the creaky wooden staircase to the second floor, where the hall stretched out long and narrow. Room 9 was at the very end, isolated from the others. The room was bare, with a bed, a single chair, and a dusty window that overlooked a shadowy forest. It smelled faintly of mold and something else, something like wet earth. Exhausted, Emma barely took off her shoes before collapsing onto the bed, hoping to catch a few hours of sleep. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging slowly along wood. She shot up, her heart pounding, straining to hear. The scratching was coming from just outside her door, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something was testing the strength of the wood. She remembered the man's words. "Whatever you hear tonight, don't open the door." Emma held her breath, listening as the scratching grew louder. It was accompanied by a slow, dragging shuffle, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor. Then she heard a voice, hoarse and guttural, like gravel scraping against metal. "Emma," it croaked, her name slipping from it like a curse. Her blood ran cold. How did it know her name? She huddled under the covers, squeezing her eyes shut as the voice repeated her name, each syllable stretched out and distorted. The scratching turned to pounding, slow and deliberate, like something was slamming itself against the door, trying to get in. She clamped her hands over her ears, willing the noise to go away, but it only grew louder, more frantic, until it was a cacophony of scratches, thuds, and that haunting voice. And then, silence. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, terrified, but all she heard was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. She dared to open her eyes, relief flooding her. Maybe it was over, Maybe she'd imagined it all. But as she lay back, she noticed something strange on the wall across from her bed. Words, faint but unmistakable, were carved into the wallpaper, as if etched by claws. "Let me in, Emma." She stifled a scream, backing away from the wall until her back hit the headboard. Her eyes darted around the room, every shadow seeming to shift and creep. She felt as though something was watching her, something waiting. Then there was a faint knock on the window. Her gaze snapped to it, and she felt the blood drain from her face. There, just beyond the glass, was a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black, her mouth twisted into a smile too wide for her face. She pressed a single finger against the glass, her nails scratching slowly as she mouthed words that Emma couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Let me in, Emma." Emma scrambled off the bed, backing away from the window, her entire body trembling. She turned to face the door, considering making a run for it, but then she remembered the scratching, the pounding, and the voice that had called her name. She was trapped. A cold dread settled over her as she realized there was no safe way out. The figure at the window began to tap, each tap louder than the last, her mouth stretching open wider and wider, a black void that seemed to pull in all the light from the room. In desperation, Emma ran to the door, ready to throw it open and make a dash for the car. But when she reached for the handle, her hand froze. Scratched into the wood of the door, barely visible in the faint moonlight, were words that made her blood run cold. "Don't open the door." She backed away, torn between fear and desperation, when suddenly the lights flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from the window. She could just barely see the woman outside, her eyes glowing faintly in the night, her mouth moving soundlessly, repeating the same words over and over. Suddenly, she felt something cold brush against her hand. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Her breaths came fast and shallow as she felt an icy finger run down her spine, stopping right between her shoulder blades. She was not alone. A voice, low, soft, and full of malice, whispered directly into her ear. "You should have let me in." Emma screamed, bolting toward the door, throwing it open and racing down the hall. She didn't look back, didn't dare glance behind her. She burst into the lobby, her heart racing, and there, sitting calmly behind the desk, was the man in the ill-fitting suit. He looked up at her with that strange smile, as if he'd been expecting her. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his tone chillingly casual. Emma, gasping for air, could only nod. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. They all do, the ones who stay in room 9. Before she could reply, she heard a faint, familiar scratching sound from behind her. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The sound grew louder, closer, and she could feel a presence looming just behind her. She turned back to the man, desperate for answers, but he was gone. The lobby was empty, and in his place was a small, cracked mirror on the wall. She stepped closer, peering into the glass, and her heart nearly stopped. Reflected in the mirror was her own face, but distorted, twisted, her mouth stretched into that horrible wide smile she'd seen on the woman outside the window. Her eyes were hollow and black, and as she stared, her reflection mouthed the words, "Let me in, Emma." The mirror cracked, splintering across the surface, and the lights flickered back on. But when she turned around, she was no longer in the lobby. She was back in room 9, standing in front of the mirror on the wall, her own reflection staring back at her with wide, haunted eyes. The door was closed, the room silent, but from outside she heard a familiar scratching sound. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear, a relentless chorus of "Let me in, let me in, let me in," and Emma knew that she would never, ever leave. The narrow road wound deeper into the woods, the canopy above casting shadows that twisted and stretched under the light of the full moon. Sarah drove slowly, her fingers tight on the steering wheel, her eyes darting to the trees lining the road. She hadn't planned to take this route, but her GPS had cut out hours ago, and now she was lost with only the faint hope that she might find somewhere to stop for the night. Finally, a sign emerged from the shadows. Cedarwood Inn. Vacancy. The motel was hidden in the trees, its lights dim and uneven. There was an unsettling quiet that seemed to hover in the air, a sense of stillness that made the place feel frozen in time. But Sarah was exhausted, so she parked, grabbing her bag and heading toward the lobby, eager for rest. The lobby was tiny and dusty, with faded floral wallpaper and a single, ancient light bulb casting a pale glow. Behind the desk was an elderly man with deep, sunken eyes and a lined face that barely acknowledged her. When Sarah asked for a room, he handed her a rusted key labeled Room 12 and, without looking up, muttered, "If you hear them, don't answer." "What do you mean, don't answer?" she asked, but he didn't respond. Instead, he went back to staring down at his hands as if she'd already left. Trying to shake off the creepy feeling settling over her, Sarah headed down the hallway, which smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. Each door she passed had a number, but no lights or sounds came from behind them. The hallway was entirely silent. It was strange and somehow too quiet, making her feel like she was the only person in the building. Room 12 was at the very end of the hall. She unlocked it and stepped inside, flicking on the light. The room was small and sparse, a bed, a single chair, and an old mirror hanging on the wall. Everything felt dusty, like it hadn't been used in years. The walls were a dull, faded yellow, with cracks running through the plaster in long, uneven lines. As she was setting her bag down, she noticed a small piece of paper on the nightstand. It looked like a torn corner from a notebook, the words scrawled hastily in pencil. "If you hear a knock, don't open the door." She felt a chill crawl up her spine, and she crumpled the note, tossing it in the trash. "It's just an old motel," she muttered to herself, trying to brush off her unease. She climbed into bed, pulling the scratchy blanket over her, hoping for a few hours of sleep. But sometime around midnight, she woke up to a soft knock on the door. Her heart skipped. The knock was gentle, almost polite, but in the heavy silence of the room, it sounded deafening. She sat up slowly, staring at the door, the warning on the paper echoing in her mind. "If you hear a knock, don't open the door." She tried to tell herself it was just the wind or maybe the old man checking on guests, but something deep inside her knew it was neither of those things. The knock came again, a little louder this time, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. She held her breath, her eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to open on its own. Then she heard a voice, a woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, help me," it whispered. "Please, hurt. Open the door. I just need a little help." Every instinct told her to ignore it, but something about the voice was so desperate, so pained. She rose from the bed, her hand reaching toward the knob, her mind screaming at her to stop. The voice was crying now, sounding closer, almost frantic. "Please, I know you're there. I can hear you breathing. I just need a little help." Sarah's hand hovered over the knob. Something about the voice didn't sit right. It sounded hollow, like it wasn't coming from a real person. She stepped back, heart racing, and forced herself to stay quiet. The crying stopped. She waited, breathless, her heart pounding in her ears. And then, another knock. This time, the voice was deeper, different. It was a man's voice, raspy and dark, like gravel scraping against metal. "Come on, just open up, just a peek." The voice was taunting, mocking, and it was growing louder. "I know you're awake in there," it sneered. "I know you can hear me. Just open the door." Sarah backed up against the wall, her eyes fixed on the door as her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The knocking turned into banging, harder and louder, until it sounded like someone was throwing their entire weight against the door, trying to break it down. She covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, desperate for it to stop. Then, silence. Slowly, Sarah uncovered her ears and looked up. The room was deathly still, but when she looked at the door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Scratch marks, deep and jagged, were etched into the wood. She hadn't heard them scratching, hadn't heard anything but the banging, yet somehow the door was marked, as if by claws. And then, slowly, her eyes drifted to the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, pale, wide-eyed, her face drawn with terror. But then she saw movement behind her. A shadow, tall and thin, standing in the corner of the room, just out of view. She spun around, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was closer, looming just over her shoulder, its face obscured. But its eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to devour the light. She turned away, trying to convince herself she was imagining things, but when she glanced back, it was closer still, almost touching her. A whisper filled the room, low and guttural. "Open the door, Sarah," it said, her name drawn out in a slow, mocking tone. Her blood froze. She hadn't told anyone her name. In a panic, she grabbed her bag, running for the door. She threw it open and dashed down the hallway, not daring to look back. She could feel something following her, its presence thick and cold, pressing against her back like a weight. She burst into the lobby, but the old man was gone, the place completely empty, as if no one had been there for years. She ran out into the night, fumbling with her car keys, glancing back only once to see a figure standing in the doorway of room 12, its form dark and hollow, its face twisted into a smile far too wide for any human. Its eyes glinted in the darkness, watching her as she stumbled into her car and sped away. As she drove, her heart racing, she caught her breath, trying to convince herself it was over. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, her stomach dropped. In the back seat, just behind her, was the same shadowy figure, its face close to hers, its eyes empty and endless, and it whispered in her ear one last time. I said, "Don't answer." Tom pulled off the interstate, the rain coming down in thick, heavy sheets that made the road nearly impossible to see. His wipers fought the onslaught of water, but visibility was close to zero, and he knew he had to find shelter fast. Just as he was about to turn back onto the highway and brave the storm, he saw a neon sign flicker on the side of the road, barely visible through the rain and mist. Moonlight Motel. Its light buzzed and sputtered, casting an eerie blue glow that seemed to pulse in time with the thunder. He parked and made a mad dash through the rain into the lobby. Inside, the motel was deathly quiet, the air thick and musty, with a faint smell of mold. Behind the counter was an old man with pale, milky eyes who didn't look up when Tom entered. When Tom cleared his throat, the man finally looked at him, his face expressionless as he handed over a key labeled Room 6. Tom thanked him, but the old man only muttered, "Keep the curtains closed, and no matter what, don't look outside." It was an odd warning, but Tom chalked it up to the strange quirks of small-town motels. Room 6 was on the far end of the building, down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked with each step. When he reached his room, he turned the key and pushed the door open to find a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The bed was old, with a faded bedspread, and the carpet was worn and stained. He threw his wet jacket on a chair and settled into bed, ready to sleep off the long day. But as he lay there, the storm outside intensified, the wind howling and rattling the windows. The air in the room felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if something unseen were pressing down on him. He tried to ignore it, closing his eyes and willing himself to sleep. Then he heard it, a faint tapping sound, almost drowned out by the rain. It was coming from the window. Tom's eyes flew open, his heart racing. He remembered the old man's warning, "Don't look outside." But the tapping continued, persistent and steady, as if someone or something was trying to get his attention. He pulled the covers up to his chin, every instinct telling him to stay put, to keep his back turned to the window. But curiosity gnawed at him. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and he could feel a strange pull, as though something was calling him, urging him to turn around. Finally, he couldn't resist. He sat up slowly and looked over his shoulder. Through the thin curtains, he could see a faint silhouette pressed against the window. It was a person, but their features were obscured, blurred by the rain and darkness. All he could make out was the outline of a face, a hand pressed flat against the glass. The figure was too still, unnaturally so, and something about it made his skin crawl. A low whisper drifted through the room, barely audible over the rain. "Let me in," it said, the voice thin and distant. "Please, let me in." Tom's throat went dry. The voice was soft, pleading, but there was an edge to it that didn't sit right, something unnatural in its tone. He backed away from the window, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the storm. But the figure didn't leave. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it were speaking directly into his ear. "Please, I'm so cold. I just need to come inside." The voice was closer now, filled with desperation, but Tom noticed something strange. No matter how loud the whispers became, the figure never moved. Its hand stayed flat against the glass, its face still a blur, as if it were nothing more than a shadow pretending to be human. Tom stumbled back onto the bed, covering his ears, trying to drown out the voice. But as he squeezed his eyes shut, he heard a scratching sound like nails dragging slowly down the glass. His pulse quickened, and he remembered the old man's words again. "Don't look outside." He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to ignore it, to block out the sound. The whisper became a scream, filling the room, echoing in his head. Let me in! Let me in! Then, silence. He opened his eyes, trembling, and glanced around the room. The figure was gone. The only sound was the steady patter of rain against the window, the storm beginning to die down. He let out a shaky breath, convinced it was over. But as he looked around, he noticed something strange, a single wet footprint in the middle of the carpet. Just one, perfectly formed, as if someone had stood right there, dripping wet. His stomach twisted as he traced the path of the prints. They led from the window, stopping just beside the bed. A chill ran down his spine as he felt the unmistakable presence of something, or someone, standing right next to him. He bolted out of bed, his eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The silence was deafening, the air thick with a sense of dread. Desperate to escape, he grabbed his keys and threw open the door, stumbling into the hallway. As he rushed past the front desk, he saw the old man watching him, his pale eyes glinting with something close to pity. "You looked, didn't you?" the old man asked softly. Tom could only nod, his heart racing. The old man sighed, shaking his head. "They're always out there, waiting for someone to notice. Once you see them, they never stop following." Tom didn't respond, too afraid to ask what he meant. He raced to his car, starting the engine and speeding away from the Moonlight Motel without looking back. The rain had stopped, but the road ahead was dark, the only light coming from his dim headlights. As he drove, his mind replayed the night over and over, the figure, the voice, the eerie footprint by his bed. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself it was just a bad dream. But when he glanced in his rearview mirror, he froze. In the back seat, barely visible in the shadows, was the same figure he'd seen at the window. Its hand was pressed flat against the back of his seat, its blurred face leaning close, whispering in a voice that sent ice through his veins, "Let me in." Lily was driving down a desolate road late at night, her only company the rolling fog that crept along the asphalt. Her GPS had lost signal miles ago, leaving her to rely on road signs and sheer luck. She hadn't seen a car, a house, or even a streetlight for miles. Then, just when she thought she'd have to sleep in her car, a small sign loomed out of the mist. Rosewood Lodge. Vacancy. The motel looked like it had been plucked from a different era. The neon sign flickered and buzzed, casting a faint glow over the empty parking lot. Weeds grew between the cracked pavement, and the building itself looked worn and abandoned. But Lily had no choice. She parked, grabbed her overnight bag, and headed inside. The lobby was musty and dim, filled with faded furniture and peeling wallpaper. Behind the desk sat a young woman with a pale, expressionless face. Her eyes seemed to follow Lily with an unsettling intensity, and when Lily asked for a room, the woman simply slid a key across the counter without a word. Room 7 was at the far end of the motel, the last door in a narrow hallway. As Lily walked toward it, she noticed how the hall grew colder, as if the temperature dropped with every step. She shivered and hurried to unlock the door. The room was basic, a bed, a small dresser, and an old TV on a dusty stand. She set her bag down, noting the faint scent of mildew in the air. A strange, uneasy feeling settled over her as she looked around. Something about the room felt wrong, but she couldn't quite place it. Telling herself she was just tired, she turned off the light and crawled into bed. Just as she was starting to drift off, she heard a faint whisper. It was soft, barely audible, like someone murmuring right next to her ear. "Help me." Lily's eyes snapped open. She lay still, heart pounding, listening to the silence. Maybe it was her imagination, a trick of her tired mind. She closed her eyes again, trying to relax. Then she heard it again, louder this time. "Please, help me." Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't her imagination. Someone was whispering in the room. She sat up slowly, eyes darting around the dark room, but saw no one. She reached for the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling as she fumbled for the switch. The light flickered on, casting a warm glow over the room. There was no one there. She let out a shaky breath, laughing at herself. "You're just overtired," she muttered, but the comfort was fleeting. She glanced around the room, double-checking that it was empty. Her gaze landed on the closet in the corner. The door was cracked open slightly, and she could see only darkness inside. A chill ran down her spine. Trying to brush off the fear, she got up and closed the closet door firmly. It clicked shut, and she felt a bit of relief. But just as she turned back to the bed, she heard a faint thud from inside the closet. She froze. Another thud sounded, followed by a soft scraping, as if something was moving inside. Her throat went dry as she took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She stared at the closet, willing herself to stay calm, to believe that it was just the old building settling. Then, slowly, the closet door began to creak open. She took another step back, horror flooding her veins as the door opened wider. Inside was nothing but darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from within. And then she saw it. A face, just barely visible in the shadows. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with hollow, empty eyes that stared at her with a look of despair. Its mouth hung open as if trying to scream, but no sound came out. Lily stumbled backward, gasping as the figure inched closer, its gaze locked onto hers. "Help me," the figure whispered, the voice so close it felt like it was inside her head. Paralyzed by fear, she couldn't move, couldn't scream. She watched as the figure crawled out of the closet, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it dragged itself toward her. Its hollow eyes were fixed on her, pleading, desperate. "Please, help me. Don't leave me here." Finally, breaking free from her terror, Lily ran to the door, yanking it open and fleeing down the hallway. She didn't look back, not daring to see if the figure was following. She bolted into the lobby where the woman behind the counter sat, still and silent, watching her with those unnervingly empty eyes. "Please, there's something, in my room," Lily gasped, pointing back toward room 7. The woman tilted her head, her expression vacant. "We don't have a room 7, ma'am." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "But I was just in there. You gave me the key." She held up the key, her hand trembling, but when she looked at it, the number on the key was faded, illegible. The woman's face softened into a sad smile. "You must be mistaken. Rosewood Lodge closed down years ago. It burned to the ground, took all the guests with it." The world seemed to spin around Lily. She stumbled back, glancing toward the hallway, but all she saw was darkness where her room had been. Without another word, she bolted out of the lobby, racing to her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she started the engine and tore out of the parking lot. As she sped away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and froze. In the back seat, she saw the same pale face staring back at her, hollow eyes filled with despair. The figure leaned forward, whispering in her ear one last time, "Please, don't leave me here forever."